I had a great question on social media recently that I really want to sort of dig down into today. So this question was from Sonia, and I'll read it out to you. Oscar, do you have any book recommendations on the history of how our society got to this point? Addicted to busyness, disconnected from self and community, devaluing the feminine, etc. I'm curious to learn more. Well, this is one of my favourite topics, and one of the questions I've really been asking myself is how did we get to the 21st century and we don't understand how important mothers are, we don't value them, they're not in a central part of our society, and they're sort of left on the fringes. And so I'm just going to explore that theme a little bit today in terms of, well, how did we go from being a matrilineal society for tens of thousands of years to a more recent patriarchal society, which doesn't extend back that far, interestingly. So when you look at all old cultures, so these are still cultures that are living the old way, this Aborigines in Northern Australia, you might have Papua New Guineans, the Aceh Indians from the Amazon, the Hadza from Africa, all these tribes that have been sort of well studied, they have this matrilineal model where societies are egalitarian, everyone is essentially equal within the society, and your social standing really comes from who your mother was, not so much who your father was, but who your mother was. When you look at old Europe, for example, very egalitarian societies, all graves very similar, so no one had a bigger grave or anything like that, and these societies probably had a lot of downtime because they were only really working for themselves and for their families, not working for an overlord or a tribal leader, those kind of things. And when it all started to change, so if we sort of go back in history, around 5,000 years BC, there was a group of people called the Yamnaya, and they were living in the Caucasus Mountains, so the original Caucasians, so the original people with essentially lighter or white skin, and they were living in a very interesting part of the world that was essentially a huge grassland, 7,000 kilometres extending from the foothills of the Caucasus Mountains right through Russia and into sort of modern-day Mongolia. And so what was different for these people is that they didn't have stable food crops, and they had to essentially wander around these grasslands following the herds of animals. And so they became very good hunters. And around 4,400 BC, they had started the process of domesticating horses. It was a time of food hardship around then, and horses were way easier to look after than cows or goats. They didn't need water, they didn't need feed, and essentially they just tie the front legs together of the female horses. Apparently the male horses are pretty rough and hard to handle back then, and these horses could be used for as a stable sort of food source, and by tying their legs together they couldn't get very far. Over several hundred years, they learnt to domesticate the horse, and they started riding the horses, so horse riding. And they became pastoralists, so sort of, and with the horses they could actually help manage these herds of animals that they were sort of following. And around 4,200 BC, again, we see the first signs of tribes being sort of set up and raiding. And so what would happen is that if people had a food shortage, they would get on horses, ride to the next village and steal stuff and sort of bring it back. This wasn't stuff that you'd see anywhere else in ancient societies, but horses provided a getaway vehicle, if you like. Again, around this time is the first time that you start seeing people of a higher standing, and the first time that we see weapons. And so Maria Gumbatis, who's written quite a lot about this, she calls it the Kurgan hypothesis. So the Kurgan is a raised mound where these chiefs or kings would be buried, and they would be buried with a whole lot more stuff, valuable things, copper and weapons. And what's interesting is that they were called, these kind of tribal leaders were called reg. And the reg were people who could hire out horses, animals, and they would kind of start a monetary sort of system around that. And the word regis, which is king, comes from that word reg. So these were essentially the first kings. And the first signs of weapons start around this time. And they were stone maces. So when you look at all these other old cultures, there was some conflict between people, but they would use hunting weapons to sort out their conflicts, and there wouldn't be many people dying in these skirmishes. So whereas we're seeing now the first signs of warfare and weapons and ways of being able to dominate other people. And so and this idea of a dominator society is actually really important, because this is a transition from going from matrilineal to patriarchal. So the person who first wrote about this, and to answer your question, Sonia, in terms of a reference or a book, probably if you're only going to read one book on this, the best book is by Rianne Eisler, and she's written a book here called The Chalice and the Blade, and she talks a lot about how dominator society sort of started. So if you're someone who can own a whole lot more than other people, and you have weapons, and you can start to have organized groups to dominate either smaller groups, or you start seeing domination of women at that time as well. And we start to see this bridal system being set up at that time too, where you'd have the daughter of a chief being sold off with a dowry to another tribe to help the peace, or maintain sort of political ties. And so around 3500 BC is where, again, another time of great food shortage, and you see these Yamnaya tribes starting to actually come into Europe, raiding villages there, and sort of going back to, and they progressively came in over about an 800-year period in 3 waves, and started to basically overtake old Europe and start to really move into Anatolia and the pre-Mesopotamian sort of societies. What's interesting, when they look at ancient DNA studies of this time, these people, the Caucasians, essentially wiped out all the males in old Europe. A lot of the female sort of DNAs is still present, but these they essentially just wiped out, and they didn't actually bring much of their own female DNA from the Caucasus Mountains, interestingly, or the Russian steppes is another way that they describe where these people sort of came from. The same thing happened in India, and it's interesting that the Rig Veda, and I'm not too sure if the word reg has anything to do with the word reg from that we mentioned before, but the Rig Veda talks about these invaders from the north coming with chariots, horses, and weapons, and essentially invaded India. And a very similar thing happened there, where not all the male DNA, but most of the male DNA was displaced with these new people, but all the female DNA from India, the ancestral DNA, came from India, didn't come from those sorts of places. So it's an interesting thing to ponder about what that might have looked like. But here we suddenly have a dominator society. And so when you have a dominator society, you have people who own a whole lot more than other people, and those other people are then working for this tribal leader, for this king, for this overlord, And this is where I think the busyness really sort of starts, because when you're working for someone else, there's no end to the amount of work that you could potentially do. Whereas when you're just working for yourself and providing food for yourself and for your family and for your immediate sort of group, you don't need to be working that hard. When you have a look at Aboriginal culture, Papua New Guineans, Aceh Indians, and some of these African tribes, they're not spending from dawn till dusk working hard. They typically work 3 to 4 hours a day, and then they have lots of leisure time, and where they would be doing music and social interaction and essentially having fun, and then sharing stories and teaching and those kind of things. So it's really interesting to sort of go from this matrilineal low workload model to this dominated patriarchal society where the people in the the second-rate citizens within that having to be overworked. Also, interestingly, around this time we start to see the first fortifications. So you have these invading tribes coming in, and then within Anatolia and Mesopotamia, some of these ancient places, you start seeing the first fortifications. Before then, the only fortifications were around flood management and wild animals. And now suddenly you see these fortifications stopping humans being able to kind of enter their cities or enter their areas of where they were living. And within Mesopotamia, because they had rather stable food sources and they had these two rivers, the Euphrates and the Tigris, running through there, they had plentiful food. But you start seeing the first city-states being started in these places, and you actually see the first empire. The Sumerians, King Sumer, who sort of started to set up the first empire, where he started dominating not only his city but other cities as well. And from there, what's interesting, what that triggered is a writing system. So the cuneiform, which is the first signs of writing, and the writing was essentially around who owned what. That was the way for hundreds of years before it actually started becoming a useful tool of human expression and language. It was just a system of delineating who owned what crops and what animals, and who owed whom things, essentially. And from there, the monetary system got started. So again, you could start to have money tokens to go, well, look, you owe me, I owe you, and so money started at that time as well. And the expansion model started. So when you're living in a matrilineal society, you don't need to expand. You don't need, you can manage resources within your locality forever after. It's what Aboriginals call continuism, that you can just continue with what you have. You don't need more, you don't need more. Whereas the expansion model that was started in Mesopotamia is that you can't survive with what you have, you need more from other places. And so this really promotes this idea of conquering, raiding, and then that really spilled over into the ancient Greeks, and then the Romans, who became sort of the first super empire that we sort of see. So when you look at how the matrilineal society started to crumble, the dominator sort of model was superimposed. There was still a lot of worship and festivals and temples and practices around honouring Mother Earth and the goddess of regeneration. The ancient Greeks, who again were another city-state civilization, who essentially took over from the Mesopotamians. The ancient Greeks, while they still had a lot of female deity worship, they had a major shift in how they viewed and valued mothers. And one of the interesting things within ancient Greek literature is this idea that who you were related to your father. So the patrilineal model started with the ancient Greeks, and they actually viewed your mother as not that important to who you were. She was purely just a vehicle for your birth. And one of the legends within ancient Greece is around Zeus. Zeus, the father of the gods, he birthed Athena, the goddess of warfare, through his head. She came out fully clothed, adult-like, through Zeus's head, and this sort of bypassed the whole aspect of goddess worship in a very sort of profound way, and really devalued the mother's role. And then from the ancient Greeks, the ancient sort of Romans were the sort of predominant power within Europe. What's interesting about the ancient Romans is that, yes, they had some very high profile females, the virgins of Vestal. They were possibly the second highest level of command within the Roman Empire, second only to the Caesar. But again, they had to be very much controlled. They had to be virgins, and they had, they were essentially kind of caged in terms of what they were allowed to do and who they were allowed to sort of mingle with. And then within Roman culture, they were the first to start with professional armies, and they were really into the slave trade. And so the Greeks had slaves, the Mesopotamians had slaves, but in terms of domination, the Romans took that to a new level. What's interesting is that after the collapse of the Roman Empire, we have the Dark Ages. And the Dark Ages were considered to be very negative, but on the positive side of the Dark Ages, you had these marauding tribes from Northern Europe, the Vandals, the Visigoths, who didn't tolerate this dominating sort of society, and so they went through and sort of destroyed as much as they could. They destroyed a lot of the writing and the literature, and there was actually a time of, interestingly, a paradoxical peace that occurred for several hundred years where but it's called the Dark Ages because not a lot is written about it, and so the darkness is in terms of just the fact that there aren't many accounts through literature of what happened during those times. But we definitely see a resurgence of the goddess during that time. What happened after that in Europe is the church became a lot more powerful, so the Catholic Church, and around the 10th century they had this, between the 10th and 13th century, a couple of key things sort of happened in Europe. One, the church essentially banished females in high roles within the church, so there were no more priestesses, priests were all men, and females were mainly involved in the church as nuns, and much lesser involved, a lot less powered. The other thing that happened in Europe at that time was the starting of the universities. And what was interesting about the universities, they were brought over from the Persian model of teaching, but unlike the Persians, the Europeans excluded 100% females from going to university and having access to information. From there, again, we're just jumping through sort of medieval sort of history. There was a very interesting sort of backlash in the 1400s with the whole burning of the witches and the fear of the church around the power of the feminine within communities. And so there are various sort of reasons for that, but that was an unimaginably horrible sort of time during Europe, and there was an attempt to eradicate many things such as herbalism. So what happened during that time was there was a very interesting shift, and we start seeing doctors appearing within sort of the European model. Females again were excluded from that, and with the time of the burning of the witches, we really see a shift away from this idea of herbalism and females helping look after females. And that was a really sort of key thing that happened at that sort of time, that females had to be looked after by men in their health. The only area that was probably still held within female domain was the birthing of children, whereas everything else, all other aspects of women's health, all aspects of education, all aspects of religion were solidly within the male domain. From there we move into the Renaissance, and again this was not a great time for women either, because it was quite disempowering for the lower class woman had already been totally disempowered. The upper class woman who could own land and still have quite high status started to see this very much reduced during the Renaissance. So the Renaissance was very, very disempowering for the upper class woman who up until then could be quite independent, could own land, and had at least some say in who she would marry. If she decided to marry, the Renaissance really brought in quite draconian rules around, again, this whole idea of woman ownership, and suddenly a woman could only own land if she was married to a man. Interestingly, the word woman comes from Old English, wifmon, wife of man. So to be a woman, you had to be married to a man in terms of that historical context of where that word came from. From the Renaissance, we move into the Industrial Age, and again, if you're wanting to really sort of look at the busyness and the dominator model, the Industrial Age really started the whole idea of the nuclear family. We were kind of living in extended families exclusively before then, the nuclear family, and then sending the workers, the fathers and the mothers off to work in off-site, so they weren't working from home anymore, they're working for other people in other places. And this is, I think, where a lot of legislation was brought in around that time. The working week, the 9 to 5, all of this came out of people essentially working in factories and within that sort of factory model. And the church had to really wrestle for Sunday to actually have time for rest, interestingly, during that sort of time. Otherwise, we would be probably working 7 days a week at the moment. So, and then from the Industrial Age, we sort of start with the first wave of feminism, the suffragettes. So women could actually get the vote, they could actually start to own land and at least start to have some independence from men and some self-governance. So tying right back to the original question of how do we get so busy, again, it's because we are living in a current society where we're working for other people, and this sort of post-industrial model is that a very small percentage of the people own most of the wealth in the world, and essentially we're working to help promote wealth for the elite, and we're working in a very subservient sort of model, and that really leads to a model where we can be so busy that we don't even have enough time for sleep, and that we're constantly pedaling very hard, not for necessarily our own gain, but just to maintain where we are, keeping our head above water, and then a lot of the distractions in our society, we don't really ask those really important questions of why are we so busy, and we just stay within that sort of consumeristic model. And we are told that we can't be happy unless we own this or that, and so we're constantly striving for something that we don't have, and that's a hallmark of the consumeristic model. And everyone who has become famous and rich understands that that model doesn't work, because you're still as unhappy as you were before attaining these the carrots of capitalism. A little bit of a history lesson, but it's a topic that I really want to talk more about. And it's interesting how we went from very peaceful, matrilineal, Mother Earth worshipping people to very quickly becoming a dominator, patriarchal society where we started worshipping the sky god. A few more resources if you're interested. I've got a few of my favourite books here. So we talked about The Chalice and the Blade, fantastic. Maria Gimbatus, who wrote a lot about the goddess societies, all the recent ancient DNA studies that have been coming out through organisations like Dave Reich. This is a great book as well if you want to read more about the ancient DNA stuff, who we are and how we got here. It's a really fantastic summary, and it's quite recent. But his work and work of others have shown that Maria Gimbatus was right on pretty much everything that she was sort of saying, whereas she was totally shunned and ridiculed during her career because they didn't think the goddess society and all these kind of things, didn't really fit that archaeology that was going on in the 70s and 80s. So this book here is quite a tome, The Civilization of the Goddess, but it's essentially a summary of all her work, written in 1991. Amazing illustrations, really incredible, and she had a lot of earlier books as well. This is a good one. Lots of great illustrations. This is a bit lighter reading, The Language of the Goddess, and then The Living Goddess is a more recent book, but again just summarising a lot of her really sort of important sort of work. And she really talked about the goddess of regeneration, so from womb to tomb, and how all these old cultures within Europe really just worshipped Mother Earth, and the idea that the female body represented Mother Earth. The female body brought life into the world, and within the matrilineal societies in Europe, they were very much involved in the birthing process. They were also the death keepers. They were keepers of the fire, and they also taught textiles. They taught and did agriculture, and they were the story keepers as well within those sort of societies. So the central cog within old Europe, and very similar things that we see in a lot of other sort of old cultures. A couple of other books just to sort of show you if you're wanting to look at the more modern archaeology and not the maybe more patricentric archaeology from the 70s and 80s. This is quite a recent book, Paul Barn, Archaeology. Came out a couple of years ago, really fantastic. And then Chris Scarr, The Human Past. Again, beautiful illustrations, really entertaining and very deep in terms of what it has, and quite approachable. So thank you, Sonia, for your question. Please, if you want to hear more about this, or if you have any more questions around anything related to motherhood and well-being, please let me know. This was just a bit of a roller coaster ride through essentially 12,000 years of history. But I think by looking at our past, we can understand our present, and then we can really move into a future with a much more conscious, open-minded way of approaching that and reaching real goals that sort of serve us as humans. And look forward to talking to you on the next topic.